Okay, welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us quite a pile of sources here, and we're ready to jump in.
Looks like a fascinating topic.
Definitely. Our mission today is really to unpack what these sources are calling the prison industrial complex. It sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
So we're going to try and pull up the key insights, the really important bits from your material, basically give you a shortcut to understanding this, well, this very complicated system.
And what strikes me right away looking through this is just the scale they describe. It's not just presented as, prisons and punishment.
Right.
It's framed as this huge multi-billion-dollar industry. You've got private companies involved, government agencies, different organizations, all, according to these sources, profiting from imprisonment.
And influencing policy, too, it seems, shaping communities.
Exactly. And they hit you with this stat right at the beginning, the U.S. having the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Yeah, I saw that over 2.3 million people currently behind bars.
That's the number they cite. And, well, it sets a pretty dramatic stage, doesn't it? Makes you question the standard story about what this system is really for.
2.3 million.
Yeah.
Highest globally. So, okay, digging into that definition a bit more. What is this prison industrial complex, fundamentally, according to these sources? Is it just about locking up criminals?
Not quite, or at least that's not the whole picture presented here. They define it more as this interconnected web, lots of different players who actually benefit financially from keeping people incarcerated.
So not just state prisons.
No, private prison companies, definitely, but also government agencies, suppliers, service providers. Their financial health is partly tied to high incarceration rates.
Hmm.
And this whole network, the argument goes, ends up influencing the laws, the policies that decide who gets locked up and for how long. It ripples out into communities.
Okay, so an interconnected system, financial drivers, and that scale, like you said. The sources put the U.S. rate at 698 per 100,000 people.
Yeah, and they provide context for that number, too. Using that World Prison Brief data, Russia's at 350 per 100,000, China's way down at 121.
So America's rate is, significantly higher, double Russia's, almost 6 times China's. That's how you get to that 2.3 million total.
Right. And crucially, your sources point out this number hasn't always been so high. It's apparently quintupled, grown 5 times since the 1970s.
Wow. What drove that huge increase?
The material points to a couple of big things. Much tougher sentencing laws coming into effect, mandatory minimums, that kind of thing. And also just a broader shift in society towards a more punitive approach to dealing with crime over those decades.
A punitive approach.
Yeah.
Which, it seems, feeds into another really concerning cycle the sources highlight.
Hmm.
They mentioned this 2023 BJS report.
The Bureau of Justice Statistics, yeah.
Right, finding that 77% of people released from prison get rearrested within 5 years. 77%.
It's a huge number.
Hmm.
And the sources connect that directly to the massive hurdles people face when they get out. Trying to find a job with a record, finding stable housing. It's incredibly difficult. Lack of support systems, too.
That's 77% recidivism rate.
Yeah.
It really makes you ask, who is getting trapped in this cycle the most?
And the sources you provided are very direct about that. They present some pretty stark data on racial disparities.
Like what?
Well, for instance, African Americans are about 13% of the U.S. population, right? But they make up 38% of the prison population.
38%.
Yeah. And citing the Sentencing Project's 2024 data, their incarceration rate is 5.9 times higher than that of white Americans.
Nearly 6 times higher. And it mentions Hispanic individuals too, doesn't it?
It does. Their rate is given as 1.3 times higher than white individuals.
These aren't small differences.
Not at all. And the material doesn't just, throw out the numbers. It tries to connect these disparities to what it calls systemic biases throughout the whole justice system.
From policing onwards?
Exactly, citing things like that Stanford study showing Black individuals are 2.5 times more likely to be stopped by police, and then potential biases in court outcomes, sentencing.
And there's an economic cost mentioned too, right?
Yeah.
Beyond just the cost of prisons.
A massive one for the individuals. The National Bureau of Economic Research estimate cited is that people who are incarcerated lose, on average, $500,000 in lifetime earnings.
Wow.
$500,000. So the system's structure, its history, it disproportionately hits certain communities hard, both socially and economically. Which kind of leads to the question of how we ended up here. The sources really focus on laws and policies, especially the war on drugs.
Yeah, the war on drugs is presented as like a real turning point, kicked off by Nixon in '71, then ramped up significantly under Reagan in the '80s.
Mm.
The material argues this was a major driver of that huge growth in the prison population we talked about. Through, really aggressive policing for drug offenses and bringing in those mandatory minimum sentences, and the numbers associated with that are pretty staggering. The Drug Policy Alliance data says 1.5 million drug-related arrests leading to prison since 1980.
Imprisonments, yeah. And the key point they make is that 80% of those were for non-violent offenses.
80% nonviolent.
Yeah. Then, building on that momentum, the sources point to the 1994 crime bill as another huge factor.
What'd that do specifically?
Well, it poured money into the system, $9.7 billion for police and prisons, with $6.1 billion of that earmarked just for building new prisons.
So funding the expansion.
Directly. And the sources argue this bill disproportionately harmed communities of color, essentially fueling more incarceration in areas already targeted by the drug war.
And didn't it bring in 3 strikes laws, too?
It did, yes. Mandating life sentences for people convicted of a third felony, even if the offenses were relatively minor, like some drug crimes.
And who did those laws affect most?
The Brennan Center study cited found that 65%, almost two-thirds of people sentenced under those specific 3 strikes provisions were Black or Hispanic.
65%.
Yeah. And the sources link this legislative push to specific policing tactics on the ground. Targeted policing in low-income neighborhoods is mentioned.
Like stop and frisk.
Exactly. They use New York City as an example. In 2011, there were 685,000 stops. And the NYCLU data showed 87% of those stopped were Black or Latino.
87%. The cumulative effect seems devastating. There's that NAACP statistic mentioned.
The one about 1 in 3 Black men being expected to be incarcerated in their lifetime?
Yeah. That's just a shocking projection.
It really is. It encapsulates the long-term generational impact the sources are describing.
So it feels like the argument here is that these policies, maybe framed as crime control, also inadvertently or perhaps purposefully created an environment where profit could be made from incarceration.
That's precisely the connection the sources draw. These economic incentives, they're like a constant thread in the material. It's not just government running prisons, it's presented as a really profitable industry.
Okay, like the private prisons.
Yeah, companies like CoreCivic, GEO Group, they're mentioned as generating around $4 billion a year.
$4 billion. And how many people do they actually house?
It's a smaller slice of the total, but still significant. About 8%, according to the Vera Institute data cited, which is around 121,000 people.
Okay, 8%. But their business model itself is revealing, based on the sources.
Very much so. The sources talk about occupancy quotas in their contracts with the government, sometimes requiring the prisons to be like 90% full.
90%. So they need beds to be filled.
Well, the financial incentive is clearly there, isn't it? The sources argue it encourages arrests and longer sentences, maybe detached from actual public safety needs.
And they make good profits.
Apparently so. CoreCivic reported a 12% profit margin in 2022, according to the material. That's quite healthy.
Beyond the private prisons themselves, there's the issue of labor within the system, right?
Yes, prison labor. It's described as incredibly cheap. Federal Prison Industries, or UNICOR, is mentioned, employs about 12,000 inmates.
And the wages.
Can be as low as 23 cents an hour, according to the GAO report cited. And this entity produces goods worth $500 million annually.
23 cents an hour, generating $500 million.
Okay. And there's another economic angle the sources bring up. How much some rural communities rely on prisons.
For jobs.
For jobs, tax revenue, yeah. It notes that 60% of U.S. prisons are in rural areas. They give the Tallahatchie County facility in Mississippi as an example.
So the argument is that this creates a local incentive to keep the prison full, to keep incarceration rates high.
That's the argument presented, yeah, a kind of perverse local economic incentive. The Prison Policy Initiative is cited as noting that by 2023, 1 out of every 5 rural counties actually hosted a prison.
1 in 5. So this isn't just about punishment or even rehabilitation, according to these sources. It's like this economic engine woven into communities' corporations.
Deeply woven seems to be the point.
But behind all the numbers, the economics, the policies, there's the human reality. And the sources really emphasize this with the story of Khalif Browder.
Yeah, his story, as told in your material, it's It's incredibly difficult. It really highlights the human cost.
Can you recap the basics? He was very young, right?
Just 16.
Yeah.
Arrested in 2010, accused of stealing a backpack, never actually convicted of anything.
American convicted
But he was held.
for 3 years at Rikers Island in New York. Why? Because his family couldn't afford the $3,000 bail.
$3,000.
Mm-hmm.
Led to 3 years inside. And the conditions.
Brutal, according to the sources. He spent 2 of those 3 years in solitary confinement, endured beatings from guards, other inmates.
2 years in solitary as a teenager.
Yeah. The charges were finally dropped in 2013. No evidence. But the sources make it crystal clear the experience broke him. Developed severe depression, PTSD, just immense trauma.
And what happened after he was released?
Tragically, the suffering didn't stop, couldn't find work, faced the stigma, the trauma haunted him. In June 2015, he died by suicide. He was only 22.
Oh, that's just devastating.
It is. And his mother, the sources note, died from a heart attack just months later. They say it was from a broken heart. His case really brought attention to the system's failures, didn't it?
Absolutely. It exposed the conditions at Rikers. The sources cite NYC correction data showing over 4,000 assaults there in 2022 alone.
4,000.
And it also really spotlighted the massive failures in mental health care within the prison system. There's an ACLU report cited saying only about 20% of inmates actually get adequate mental health treatment.
So only 1 in 5.
Right. Browder's story, especially after a documentary came out, it really put a human face on these systemic issues, challenging that whole narrative of a just system.
Yeah, makes the statistics feel much more real, more devastating. Let's pull back again to the broader picture, the overall cost of this system. The sources mention a huge figure.
$80 billion a year. That's what the U.S. spends on corrections, according to the BJS data cited for 2024.
$80 billion. How does that compare to other spending?
Well, the sources make a point of comparing it. It's more than the national spending on education, which is around $79 billion, and way more than mental health spending, cited at $48 billion from NAMI data.
More on corrections than education. Wow.
Yeah. And maybe even more telling is how that $80 billion corrections budget is actually used.
How so?
A Vera Institute analysis cited finds that only 5%, just 5 cents on the dollar, goes towards rehabilitation programs.
Only 5% for rehab out of $80 billion.
That's the figure presented. It really forces you to question what the priority actually is, doesn't
It
it?
really does. And the costs aren't just taxpayer dollars, right? The sources talk about costs to families.
Yeah, significant costs. The Ella Baker Center estimate cited is $1.5 billion a year just in lost wages for families, plus caregiving costs when someone's incarcerated.
And the impact on kids.
Profound. That Annie E. Casey Foundation stat. 1 in 14 Black children has a parent incarcerated. Think about the disruption to families, to communities.
It's just immense, and the profit motive keeps popping up, even in basic services inside prisons.
Seems so. The sources mention companies like Aramark providing prison food. They've faced lawsuits over really awful conditions, maggot-infested meals reported in Michigan prisons, citing the Detroit Free Press. Yet they still hold these massive contracts, like the $1.5 billion one mentioned. It suggests, according to the sources, that profit can sometimes overshadow basic human needs or safety.
So this picture of pervasive commodification, it really challenges the idea that the system is mainly about reform or justice.
That's the core argument, yes. It points instead to a system deeply tangled up in economic interests and those racial biases we discussed.
But public opinion might be shifting. The sources mention protests.
Yeah, the George Floyd protests are mentioned as bringing conversations about police funding, prison funding more into the mainstream. And there's a Pew Research poll cited from 2024 suggesting 54% of Americans now actually support reducing incarceration levels.
So more than half. That's interesting.
It suggests a potential disconnect between public sentiment and the direction the system has been heading for decades.
Okay, so stepping back and looking at the whole argument presented in your sources,
Yeah.
it's a deeply critical view, isn't it? The idea that this is primarily about rehabilitation or even just public safety seems, well, really challenged.
It's fundamentally questioned, yeah. The consistent focus on profit, the stark racial disparities laid out, they undermine those narratives.
And the sources make some historical comparisons too, right?
They do draw some provocative parallels, arguing that the way the war on drugs disproportionately impacted minority communities echoes older systems of control, like Jim Crow laws, even if the intent was framed differently.
And the private prisons, the cheap labor.
They draw a line, however uncomfortable, to the economic functions of slavery, extracting economic value from controlled populations. It's a strong claim, but it's based on the economic structures described.
And those spending priorities we talked about. $80 billion on corrections, 5% on rehab. They seem to bolster that critical perspective.
Absolutely. Especially when contrasted with evidence about other investments. Like that RAND study mentioned. Every dollar put into quality pre-K gives back $7 in long-term benefits. Less crime, better health, higher earnings.
So the choice to fund prisons so heavily instead of things like education, the sources suggest that's a deliberate choice that sustains this complex.
That seems to be the implication, that it's hard to accept claims of prioritizing reform or prevention when the money flows so overwhelmingly towards incarceration itself.
But it's not all bleak. The sources do mention alternatives, right?
Oh,
Things that actually work.
they do. They mention community-based programs, for example. An Urban Institute study is cited showing these can cut recidivism by 20%.
20% reduction, that's significant.
It is, which brings us back to that fundamental question the sources seem to pose again and again.
If these less costly, more humane, and effective alternatives exist.
Why isn't the investment flowing there instead of into maintaining and expanding the current system?
Right. Okay, so we've journeyed through this material you provided. We've looked at the sheer scale, the troubling racial dimensions, the powerful economic forces at play, private profit, cheap labor, and that heartbreaking human cost, epitomized by Khalif Browder's story.
Yeah, the core argument that comes through from all these different angles in your sources is pretty consistent. That this system, whatever its stated goals, is deeply bound up with profit and historical biases, and these factors continue to harm some communities while benefiting others.
So the final thought we want to leave you with, based on everything we discussed from your sources, is this. We see this massive $80 billion annual investment in corrections. We see only 5% of that going to rehabilitation. We know about the long-term payoff from investing in things like early education, that 7-to-1 return. Given all that, what do these spending priorities where the money actually goes back tell us about what our society collectively truly values?
It's definitely a heavy question to ponder after digging into all this.
It really is.
It's a-
Thank you for providing these sources, and thanks for joining us for this deep dive.